This presentation is about editing numbers. We can think of editing numbers in two main ways. First of all, numerals versus words, and then numbers in a context. First, numerals versus words. So Chicago has a general rule that can be very useful, though it might not be what some have been taught. They say spell out numbers 0 through 100 in most cases. So 32 would be spelled out just as 11 or 8. But there's an alternative rule, which is probably the one that most people learn, and that's to spell out numbers 0 through 9, and then after that you can use the number itself. And that's fine too. It's a matter of being consistent. The rest of this is about some special cases of that rule. So for hundreds, thousands, 100,000s, spell them out, 1 through 100 followed by 100,000 and 100,000. So a millennium is a period of 1,000 years. But when you're being very precise, for example, 47,122, makes more sense to use the number. Basically, never start a sentence with a numeral. Always spell it out, or you can reword it. So 110, or in all, 110, and in that case, use the numeral. For ordinals, follow the general rule, which is again, whichever one you choose, 1 through 100 or 1 through 9, follow your rule and then include the th, nd, or rd with the numeral. Italicize the n in nth, so whenever you want to talk about nth degree or whatever, you need to italicize that n, which goes back to the way we should treat letters when we use them as letters. Millions, billions, and so forth follow the general rule for whole numbers with million, billion. So the city had grown from 3 million in 1960 to 14 million. But if we were following the 0 through 9 rule, we would need to spell out 14, or rather use the numeral 14. But you can sense how that's a little weird in that sentence. So Chicago generally encourages flexibility. So maybe in that case, you would just use the numeral 3 if you wanted to also use the numeral 14. Use numerals for fractional quantities, so 13.5 and 14 in that case. So for physical quantities in general context, you can spell them out, 15 minutes, 20 degrees, but if it's more convenient for the reader and you think it just looks better and is more useful, just use the numeral, as in these cases. For simple fractions, you can spell them out, 4/5. For whole numbers plus the fractions, it may be spelled out if they're short, but often they're just given in numerals. So we walked for 3 1/4 miles, or I need 6 7/8 yards of the silk fabric. You can sense when it might be awkward to spell out and when it just makes sense to use the numeral. So when you have numbers with abbreviations and symbols, which is common in a technical context when you need to give the unit of measurement, it's always expressed as a numeral, 50 kilometers, 4.5 liters, and so on. Don't use a hyphen between the number and the abbreviation, even when you're using it in adjectival form, so a 50-kilometer pipeline. You do not need to add a hyphen there. But use space between the numerals and the units of measurement, except for when you're talking about degree, when you have that little symbol, when you have the percent sign, or when you're using the prime symbol, which is often used as a replacement for feet and inches. Units of repeated measures. So repeat abbreviations if they're closed up, degree, percent, and prime, like mentioned previously, but not if they're not closed up. So it's pretty much everything else. So 35% symbol, in dash 50% symbol, but 2 by 5 centimeter, not 2 centimeter by 5 centimeter. So it's really only the percent, the degree, and the prime that needs to be repeated in those cases. So for percentages, express them as numerals, except of course when they begin the sentence. So again, you might need to reword the sentence so you could use it as a numeral. But in non-technical contexts, it can be okay to use the word percent. Otherwise, just use the percent symbol. For monetary symbols and numerals, isolated references to money are spelled out for whole numbers of 100 or less, which is the general rule, 75 cents, $15. Whole amounts expressed numerically should include zeros and decimals only if they appear with fractional amounts. So in this case, it would have been fine to have a dollar symbol 10, but because we're talking about 95 cents up to $10, that first instance of 95 cents had a fractional amount, so we have to fill in the blank for 10.00 to be consistent. So that's basically what that idea is getting at. For large monetary amounts of more than $100, they're expressed as numerals. So most homes that went into foreclosure were valued at more than $95,000. So it's a big number. We're going to just use the numeral. The year used alone, expressed as a numeral. So 1935, you don't need to spell it out, except at the beginning of a sentence. So 1935 is the year that whatever, you might want to just say in 1935 and then state whatever you need to state. Use cardinal numbers for months and days, meaning spell them out. But even if they are pronounced as ordinal numbers, so this is something that's a common issue. So if I ask you put the date at the top of the paper, a common mistake is if, for example, it's the 15th of August, people will put a TH, August 15th, TH. Don't do that, and that's what this rule is getting at. Even if I pronounce it that way, don't put a TH, always just put the number. Spell out centuries, but lowercase them. The 15th century, for example. For decades, choose the numeral or the word, but be sure the century is clear and lowercase it. So the 1940s, the 40s. For the time of day, spell it out in running text, and when you want to put o'clock, always spell it out. So it's 5 o'clock or 5:30. You can spell that out too. Though it often depends on the context, I can see some arguing rather to just use the numeral for 5:30 p.m. And that's what this next idea is getting at. If you're getting at, you want to include the PM, then use the numeral, and you can choose how you want to treat AM, PM. You could use periods, you can omit periods, or you can put them in small caps, but don't put spaces between them. For the 24-hour system, commonly called military time, use numerals with punctuation between the hours and minutes unless the word hours is actually used. So 1500 hours, but if you want to put 1500 and the word hours, you don't need that punctuation, the colon. For monarchs, popes, and so on, use the Roman numeral. So Elizabeth II or Pope Benedict XVI, you don't want to put the Arabic 16 or the Arabic 2 ND. They want to use Roman for these. Numerals with personal names, it really depends on the person, as you can see in these cases, versus whether you do Roman or not. For highways, use Arabic. So US Route 41 and so on. For street numbers, follow the general rule for spelling them out, and you use the cardinal version, so 122nd ND Street. Now numbers in context. So to make them plural, spell out the numbers to form the plural as you do normally for any other plural. When you're going to add it to a numeral, add an S, but don't use an apostrophe. For commas between digits, most countries will put commas between groups of 3 digits, like 1,512, 32,987. But this rule does not apply for page numbers, line numbers, addresses, or years. Use an in dash when it implies to and including or through. So this goes back to the punctuation rules. So this is a bit of a review, but here's an extra different addition to it. So when we're saying if we had 75 to 110, it could be 75 n-110. But if the sentence is using the words from or between, do not use an n-. So from 75 to 110. Do not use an n- there because they're using from. If we're talking about between about 150 and 200, we do not use an n- because we use the word between. This is a little bit tricky. It's when you abbreviate inclusive numbers. This is the way that Chicago likes to do it. So for less than 100, you use all of the digits, so 3 to 10. For 100 or multiples of 100, use all the digits, so page 100 to page 104, page 1100 to 1113, use all the digits. But when you're talking about 101 through 109, 201 to 209, 301 to 309, and so forth, use only the changed part. So what does that mean? 101 to 108 is what's being communicated in that example, but I'm only talking about the changed part, which was the first unit, the first single digit. For 808 to 833, we don't need to include another 8 because the only changed part is the tens digit. Same thing with that 1000 example. But when it's 110 through 109, use 2 digits unless more are needed. So 321 to 28, obviously there's a change there between the single digit. And then there's a change between 498 to 532, and its changed part is actually in the hundreds. From 1087 to 1089, the only changed part is the single digit, and so on and so forth. The point is, you don't have to use as many digits, and this can be very useful, for example, in tables, or when just communicating generally about a bunch of ranges of numbers. It's a matter of kind of thinking about these rules and looking at the instance in front of you, and I can understand how it can be a bit challenging, but it's always a matter of taking things one by one, and you can also ask for help. For Roman numerals, generally you just use all the numbers, but we don't often use those, but it's just a point to be made. So that's editing numbers. Consult these lecture slides as a cheat sheet rather than using Chicago, but in some cases you might need to check Chicago for some special instances.